Jeff Campbell, class of 1965, part of the first edition of the Fairfield Rugby Club in the fall of 1963, 50 years ago now as we speak, almost. We get a few months to go. Played prop at 205 pounds. I'm probably 30 pounds lighter than that now, which is probably a good thing. We were, as we'll talk about probably as we tell stories, we were not too big. We were kind of undersized. We were pretty quick.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that seems to be the story with a lot of the people that I've talked down through the years. Very, very much so. So how did you compensate for size? Just speed and?
We had a great group. You know, one of your questions before I showed up was about what backgrounds did people come from, and most people were former football players, and we tended to play the game that way because we were new to it. We didn't know anything else. And if we played bigger teams, we could beat them with speed. The problem we had was the first game we played against Harvard Business School up in Cambridge, and it was full of expatriates, and they knew how to play the game. So we kind of felt like you know, dogs chasing parked cars there for a while, and you know, would be all set to nail somebody, and they'd kick the ball downfield, and we were generally confused for a good part of the afternoon. But we could usually out-quick and out-muscle most teams, and we went all the way to the final game of the sevens that year, our first year in Van Cortlandt Park. Mm-hmm. And we had pretty much kicked the stuffing out of 4 teams, and then we ran into Columbia Old Blues A, which was a bigger version of us. And they were the Ivy League football champions from 1961, made up the backbone of that team, and it was Tom Haggerty and Harry Hirsch and Dick Donnelly, Billy Campbell, Russ Warren, who's now the team physician for the Giants. And bigger, faster beats smaller, faster, as it turned out.
Yeah, yeah. Well, let's go back a second to your own introduction to what would become a 50-year-old institution on campus here. You know, what was the opening? How did that whole thing happen?
You know, it's a lot of that is lost in the fog of memory. Yeah. So my reconstruction it would have been Peter Fallon and Doug Ciacci that roped me into this, because I think I missed the first game against Fordham. Mm-hmm. So I think I was just about then that they said, hey, you gotta get out here. And of course we had our practices on that amazing vertical pitch. Which I have a lot of funny memories of, you know, people expiring running uphill on Corbett Field. So.
So, but why did you like this sport so much? I mean, what attracted you to it?
We didn't have a contact sport, you know, here. This was the right place for me to be in terms of a school and lots of the experiences I got because it was of a size where I could do a lot of different things. Mm-hmm. But athletically, I wanted to play a contact sport.
Mm-hmm. So you were part of a sort of a pioneering group of guys. You were blazing new trails on the field, learning how to do the parties, and very importantly, running a club as students, which has always been very impressive. So let's talk about those 3 areas. The game itself. How did you guys develop your knowledge of the game, and how did you get to be so good at the sport?
You know, when I think about it, I don't think we were as knowledgeable as we might have been. I think we were just, you know, full of energy and enthusiasm. That's the way we approached the game. And because we happen to have some very skilled players, particularly Doug Ciacci and Al Sullivan, who were, those 2 guys were just amazing backs. Ciacci had been an all-state halfback at New Britain High School, Floyd Little's rival as a running back in the state. 5'7", 190 pounds, a slasher, bull, a force of nature. Al Sullivan was 5'6", about 165, 170. He was a darter. Just a beautiful combination of runners. We had Bob Batch and Ken Waters, who were really fast, slick. The scrum was small but tough. Yeah. Mike Kelly and John Swanhouse was our hooker, myself as the other prop, Tom Petticord, John Bender, John Sullivan, great group.
Yeah.
Great group. Yeah, I think, you know, you get better based on the level of competition. Yeah. So, you know, playing the teams that actually had the greater level of rugby know-how got us smarter over time. Like I said, when we started with that first one, Harvard Business School, the first time, it was pretty embarrassing at times. We got better. After I was in the service, I got out and played for Old Blue for a while, and I thought, I got an education that I hadn't gotten here, to be honest. Everybody was yelling ruck. I thought it was a guy on the club, so we made up for knowledge with enthusiasm.
So when you were playing, what would a typical game day be like down at what became Corbett Field, what we call the old field?
That's a fun memory, really. It was the long walk down from the dorm, or driving your date over if you had one in town. The walk down the hill, the gathering, the speech by Doc Kenyon of beloved memory, getting it on, the walk back up the hill, getting to the party. It was a great social experience. I can still see in my mind's eye all the crowd at the rim of that hill on Corbett Field.
Yeah, and you had pretty good crowds, like
decent.
Once
Yeah,
word
it was
got
a
out
real
there.
mix of
Yeah.
locals and students and professors, faculty. Well,
Somebody's-
Malachi McCourt used to referee our games, and he was also master of the revels at a lot of the parties. And I can remember him changing with us in a room up in Loyola before a game that he was going to referee. So he was really hot stuff. He was quite a New York character. Used to be on the Johnny Carson show all the time, most of the time loaded, which only made him funnier. But then, particularly as I recall games in Van Cortlandt Park, there was a bar that John Bender remembers the name of, and I don't, above the L, or across from the L, across from Van Cortlandt Park, and would have these big rugby parties in there with the other teams, and McCourt would be singing all the rugby songs, and he was a piece of work. Doc Kenyon was a great man. Chris Groward asked me if I could find him, and to date I haven't been able to find him, but in the past week a 53-year-old Scotswoman who was applying for the master's program I run at San Diego State had applied, and I got thinking about her, so I sent her an email and said, Leslie, do you still maintain contact with Scotland? And she said, yes. I said, I'm looking for my old rugby coach. And the email I got back from her immediately said, my father and my brother are rugby players. I used to run the rugby bar in Edinburgh, and I'll find out, so we'll see if we get anything out of that. But Doc Kenyon was just a great guy. I had him both as a psych professor, which is probably why I didn't get flunked out, and as a rugby coach. Sweet man, knew the game. We all loved him. I'd love to find him and find that he's alive. And then we can figure out how to get him here by October.
And what about Corbett? He's
Bob Corbett. Bob and I went to high school together. We came here together. Every time I drive to this campus coming up the Merritt, I remember Bob Corbett, because right after you make the right turn on a North Benson by the Angus Steakhouse, there's a street called Pansy Road. And when we were freshmen, Bob lived off campus. And the first time I saw him, after we gathered at Fairfield, I said, Bob, where are you living? And he went, Pansy Road. So every time for 50 years, as I drive up here, I pass Pansy Road, I always think of Bob. Great guy, part of a little three-man crew with the Gimp Sullivan and Ray the Crow McDermott. They roomed together. They were really like a traveling comedy act. Everybody played rugby. We'd laugh at each other in the middle of games, and needless to say, laughed a lot at the parties afterward.
Okay, let's move on to the social side. You guys were blazing a good trail in that regard too, and clapping the other team off, getting together with the other team. It's always been a pretty unique part of rugby.
Yeah, we loved it.
Did you found that as refreshing an approach?
Huge, and I know one of your questions about our club status and the relationship on campus, and it was always edgy, tenuous, I would say.
Yeah.
So we tried to keep our nose clean because we treasured the social part of the game as much as the athletic part of the game, and we knew one step out of line, and that was going to be history. And we, thank God we were able to do that. A couple of memories I have distinctly. about parties. One was, and this may not have been literally a rugby party, but it was dominated by the rugby club. And it was the night the Beatles made their first appearance on Ed Sullivan in the early spring, late winter of 1964, and we had rented a room above a firehouse in Tarrytown, New York, and it was quite a show. Also, Dan Gaddy, who hopefully will be here for the reunion, who's the year behind us, one of the toughest players in the history of the club, I'm sure. He's a sort of a neighbor of mine in San Diego. So a couple of years ago, I had a dinner party, just the Gaddys and the Finnerans. Brian Finneran was a member of the class of '65, who I have the good fortune now to have living across the fairway from me, after not seeing him for 45 years. So that's just been one of the great delights in our life. But we were having a dinner party, and after we'd had sufficient lubrication, where I could say this or ask the question in front of Dan's wife, I said, we were having a rugby party one night, and I was with a fairly unattractive local woman, and you came up to me and said, or I think it was you, so I'm testing this. You said X, which I won't dare to repeat on this video. And Gaddy, without blinking, I said, that was me. So I don't know how much the ladies enjoyed it, but Brian and I got a big kick out of it.
Yeah.
And that was part of the spirit of the camaraderie of the group.
You talked about meeting lovely. Could you expand on that a little bit? Given that, you know, Fairfield University was all male, and I was fortunate myself to be able to meet my wife, who was part of the very first class of women. So, but you know, that was my junior year, you know, before that happened. So the first 2 years, I can appreciate what you guys went through for 4 years. So given that it was all male, did playing rugby help at all with?
By the time I was a senior, I provided my own pulchritude supply on a regular basis. But before that, I would say that our relationship collectively with women was Clinton-esque in the sense of levels of pulchritude. And that's not good.
And let's talk about that whole other aspect of this experience where you had, you know, a sport like most sports people your age, you know, when you played, relied on adults as coaches, as administrators of the sport or the league or whatever you're in. And here you guys are. You're in charge of everything. How did that help, would you say, in terms of your own post-college career?
Yeah, I would. I think, you know, a lot of formative experiences we have are when we're thrust into some role of leadership or responsibility, preferably with the less training, the better, as far as I see it. And so whether that was running a club or whether it was editing the Stag or the yearbook or, you know, something else, all that stuff is formative in developing what I think is the most important factor, which is self-confidence, you know, that you know what you're doing. And I think, yeah, we were kind of our own adult supervision for the most part as the leaders of the club. But it was also a very cohesive group of guys. So we didn't have outliers. We didn't have psychodrama in the group. As I reflect back on it, I think in retrospect, that's one of the highlights. You know, I loved every one of those guys, and you know, hopefully, we'll see some of them.
Yeah. Well, let's skip ahead to the question that kind of ties in with that. The quote that somebody made within a previous interview was that he felt there was an unwritten code of honor within the club that said that we look out for each other, we have each other's back on the field and off. And part of this feeling stemmed from the fact that within the university, as a sport and a club, you were always on your own. So you'd
always
agree?
on our own, a little embattled, perhaps, in terms of the officialdom of the school, not by the balance of the faculty or the student body. Doc Kenyon, of course, was wonderful. But yeah, we were a little bit on our own, a little bit on the edge. We loved what we were doing. We were really, in the Shakespearean sense, a band of brothers. And one of the things that struck me as I was thinking about doing this interview was that those guys collectively and individually were the audience I've played to for my whole life. even when I was running a company,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of times when I think about what I'm about to do, I would think about how a lot of people would take it, but in the back of my mind was always, what would the guys think? And I did some really stupid things, by the way, for laughs, because I thought the guys would have liked it. So, I probably hurt myself a couple times in my career, but this was the audience. This band of brothers was the audience I've basically been playing to for 70 years now, almost. Just turned 69 on Friday, so getting close.
Happy birthday.
Thanks.
That's great. Wow. So yeah, it kind of also ties in with another dynamic that I don't know if it affected you guys, but what was going on in the outside, the campus walls world around us. The Vietnam War had started, and there was beginnings of this whole revolution in social attitudes.
We mostly missed that.
Yeah.
It was only toward the end of our senior year in '65, when they were really first starting to escalate in Vietnam, that the first smattering of protest activities on campus began. So we were almost pre-boomer silent generation in a lot of our attitudes. And technically some of us, I guess we all were, from class of '65 and before, technically pre-boomers.
Yeah, right. Before we get into that, some of the game memories that you might have. Where did that come from? Luch, where did you get that name?
It's printable.
Is it?
Yeah.
Okay.
So the name Luch, which only the Fairfield gang knows about, came as a shortened version of Campbell. And for some reason in my freshman year, because Pascale and I hung out together and we were always into where the best Italian meal could be had, there was some Italian thing. Maybe I had a couple other guys I was hanging with that were Italian, but they decided I needed to be adopted into the Italian family. So I became Campbellucci, which got shortened to Luch. Most people who've been calling me Luch for 50 years don't know the origin of the story, but who cares? I still want to make a license plate with that on it, though.
Yeah.
I'm old enough to get away with it.
Sure. That's funny. That's great. Okay. So let's talk about any particular events, people, game situations stick out in your memory that you'd like to share.
I think the proudest memory goes back to 50 years ago this coming November, to the first 7-a-side tournament in Van Cortlandt Park. We'd never been in one. We thought the game played to our strengths because it's a lot more running, fewer guys on the field. It seemed like that was for us, and you play till you lose, and we won the first 4 games, and wind up in the nasty little stadium there for the final against Columbia Old Blues A's. And like I said, those guys were a bigger version of us, and they'd been playing it. They'd actually been playing it at the same amount of time, but most of them had played football together on that Ivy League championship team. So they knew each other better than we probably did. And about 2/3 of the way through the game, Doug Ciacci got kicked out of the game by a very snotty referee. That didn't help. But I ran into one of those opponents later in life when I was at Pepsi. I'm sure John Swanhouse knew him too, but I was asked right after joining Pepsi to connect with one of the most powerful bottlers in the system, because we were working on a strategic plan and partnering up corporate and bottler leaders. And that turned out to be Harry Hirsch. And Harry Hirsch had played against us in that 7-a-side game for Columbia Old Blues A. And people would ask Harry, and we realized at the first lunch we had together, and talking about the rugby bond. And when people would ask Harry later, did you and Jeff really know each other back then? He'd go, nah, he was always laying face down in the mud. I never got to see him. So those are, and that Columbia team was something special. Another fond 1963 memory, fond only in retrospect, is almost drowning at the bottom of a pile in Charles River Park playing the Boston Rugby Club. One day there was a puddle down there, and I was face down in it. And I had the thought ran through my mind that this would be a particularly stupid way to die. And then the final one was my only try as a prop came in the second seven-a-side tournament, game one, against a team called Drew University, who we were told all they did was practice for sevens. They weren't very good, actually. And Malachi McCourt called it. So
Yeah, wow.
yeah. John Swanhouse, you know, he was 2 years behind us, class of '65. So I knew him as the hooker. I knew him as this great young man who we shared everything with, and I have a distinct memory, which Betsy I'm sure won't want to hear about, of holding him up by the scruff of his neck at someplace on the grounds of the Harvard Business School in the aftermath of a rugby party, trying to find him his car. So, you know, later knew John. We were both at Pepsi, and he was running Stolichnaya. And then again, another vignette, and that's the way I find life is remembered. Driving out of the parking lot at Joe Pascale's funeral in 2004, John was walking toward his car, and we stopped and, you know, rolled the window down and shared a couple of, you know, poignant recollections, and that was the last time I saw him. John Sullivan, loved the guy. We weren't close friends, but there was always a unique bond between us, and the vignette with John is the two of us knuckleheads on a day in the summer of 1965, both almost drowning because we were trying to body surf right after a hurricane down the Jersey Shore. Nobody around, no lifeguards, just us. And when we both finally crawled back up on the beach and stopped bobbing for air, the next reaction was to start laughing, and that was John. And just a great guy. I had a wonderful day here on campus with him in 2009, just he and Bob Beauregard and I walking the campus for an hour or two on a day like this, reminiscing. There's a great scene in the movie The Way We Were where Robert Redford and one of the other guys in the cast are out on a sailboat. The camera's looking down on them from above, and they're reminiscing, and one of them says, "What was the best Saturday?" And they're trying to pick the best Saturday. What was the best? And that day in my life, that was one of the best. It was probably a Wednesday, one of the best ones. Doug Ciacci, I've written a long blog post about him that the club picked up. That was a labor of love. I found out Doug had been killed my first week when I was at Fort Dix in basic training. Was glad, thinking about it, that I wasn't at the funeral. I couldn't have stood seeing his dad. He was, as I said in that blog, enthusiasm incarnate. He was a force of nature. Sweet, sweet guy under a very tough exterior. He would wrestle whatever you threw at him to the ground, physically, athletically, socially. He was just a prince of a guy. Again, you know, vignettes and really good ones. One thing I'd like to talk about, if it's okay, is the Ciacci Award, and trying to get him in the Hall of Fame, and also the Ciacci Pascale Scholarship. I want to give that a little pitch because it's almost 30 years old now, and you know, we've been putting student athletes through the school for a while. So if any of those 2,000 ruggers wanted to do something about that, you know, every little bit helps.
Yeah. Well, what is that scholarship?
Well, I was on a business trip to Minneapolis 30 years ago, and you know, I had one of those great thoughts that comes to you when you're in that twilight zone between sleeping and wakefulness in the morning. And I got thinking about Doug. And in those days, Pillsbury, which was the parent company of Burger King, would match any contribution you made toward a charitable program. And so we started the Ciacci Scholarship Fund using that money, mine and theirs, as the catalyst. And in the last almost 30 years now, we have put 20 to 30 student athletes through Fairfield University with ever-increasing financial contributions. When I get up here in the summer, I try to have lunch with whoever the latest recipient is. But that fund exists. It's now called the Ciacci Pascale Fund because they were the two captains, basketball and rugby, who've left us. Doug was a dear friend. Joe was my roommate. And so if any of those Rugger alumni out there would like to contribute to that fund, we'll probably put some out because we're coming up on our own 50th as well. But you know, it's in their names. It's consistent with the spirit of what we talked about earlier, the spirit of this club. And I want to keep those names alive. And Doug, I'm thrilled that the MVP award is in his name. I am not dying until he's in the Fairfield Athletic Hall of Fame, and it may take me that long. But our 50th class reunion is coming up next year, so maybe that's or the year after next. Okay, I'm really in early stages of dementia here, but by then I want to make sure we get him in.
Yeah.
If I was thinking about talking to, a young man or woman that's entering the sport for the first time now as undergraduates, I'd say hold on to what's going to happen to you and savor every moment of it, because it's going to last a lifetime. Just last week, I was in a meeting with 3 senior executives from a resort casino in San Diego talking about our master's program. And it was a typical business meeting, very cordial, until the head of operations and marketing, who's 20 or 30 years younger than me, realized we were both rugby players. Ball game over. Couldn't stop talking on the way out. Right? That'll be a bond that will continue. The master student I mentioned from Scotland, whose father and brother were ruggers, it's a bond. It's a religion. And so, even though we were on the front end and didn't inherit any traditions, we were exploring, what this was all about. As I look back on it, I'd say the camaraderie, that band of brothers and sisters now mentality, having each other's backs, staying connected, it's a lifetime commitment and a lifetime pleasure.
Perfect. That's great. Yeah. That's
When I was an undergraduate here, 2 things were probably true. When I started playing rugby, I was 19 years old. Don't know much at 19. The world was pretty new to me. Fairfield itself was pretty young at the time. And so I couldn't have envisioned sitting here at the age of 69 talking about the 50th anniversary of that club that started on that bizarre field with no uniforms and a jocular Scotsman trying to explain the game to us. And I'm also amazed and proud of what has happened to this university over those 50 years. It was a great place for me to be then. I couldn't have picked a better one. There were lots of others I applied to, but this was exactly right for me. But it's just grown and prospered and flowered, and the rugby club along with it. So this is, it's really very powerful for somebody my age to look back and see how that unfolded.